Hello, my name is Sarah Florence Davidson, and I'm going to be talking to you today about making meaning from stories. And I'll be using the Skada story series as an example. I am recording this presentation on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Stalo peoples, and I am incredibly grateful to be able to do this work on this territory. Just as a brief introduction, my Haida name is Anjat Gusandlans, which means killer whale woman of the dawn. I belong to the Yakutlanas clan, which is a raven clan from the Haida. And my father is Robert Davidson. He belongs to the Oth clan, which is an eagle clan, and his Haida name is Otsandlans, which means eagle of the dawn. My mother is Susan Davidson, and she identifies as a colonizer. And she was adopted by my great-grandmother into the Yakutlanas clan because the Haida are matrilineal. So in order for my brother and I to have a place in the Haida community, it was important that that adoption take place. And I am a Haida Settler assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Simon Fraser University. In 2018, my father and I published a book called Potlatch's Pedagogy, Learning Through Ceremony. And just this past September, we released 2 books from the Skada Story series, and they're picture books. And so my father and I collaborated on those with Janine Gibbons, who is the illustrator. And I have a PhD in literacy education from UBC, and I have about 9 years experience teaching grades 6 to 12 and also adult learners in rural BC and Yukon. I am super passionate about literacy and specifically Indigenous stories and storytelling. So if you're interested in connecting with me more about that, my website is sarahflorence.ca, no H, and Twitter and Instagram, you can find me at Sarah F. Davidson. Twitter tends to be more articles and books, and Instagram tends to be more books and photos. You get the occasional photo of my puppies, so there's that added bonus. I'm having some technical difficulties, so there's maybe going to be a little pause between changing the slides, but I hope that it will change soon. There we go. To situate ourselves a little bit, the books all take place, so there are actually 4 books in the series, and they all take place on the territory of the Haida Nation, and that includes the waters surrounding Haida Gwaii. And you'll notice that there's a little bit of southern Alaska there. Heidelberg, Alaska is also a Haida village. And so I just wanted to share this map in case there was just some interest in where the stories take place. And so Haida Gwaii, you can see, is off the northwest coast of what is currently known as British Columbia. And so just in terms of thinking about where we're going to be situated for these books, that is the location. And you'll see, you can, in the actual books, there are maps, so you can take a little more time with them if you are specifically interested in the geography of the stories. I wanted to acknowledge that these books were a collaboration, and so I did write them with my father, Haida artist Robert Davidson, and Janine Gibbons, who is a multidisciplinary artist, and she is also Haida, helped, and she really worked with the illustrations and bringing the stories to life visually. So my father and I worked together on these books, and it's a series of 4 learning stories, and the stories are based on our family stories. And so the first 2 in the series were written from my father's perspective, and the second 2 were written from my perspective, and those ones will be released in September of 2022. And the idea behind the books is that they sort of follow my father along. And so in the first book, my father is a grandson. In the second book, he's a son. In the third book, he's a father. And in the 4th book, he's a grandfather. And in books 1 and 2, they focus more on my father's learning. And in books 3 and 4, it focuses a little more on my learning and my father teaching. So there's that element of intergenerational teaching that also takes place in the books. And they were really intended to explore Indigenous pedagogies and just provide some examples and thinking about Indigenous pedagogies. And so books 1 and 3 focus on more land-based teachings and specifically fishing. And books 2 and 4 focus on the sharing and transmission of art and cultural knowledge. In book 2, it's focused on Archeolite carving, and book 4 is focusing on a Haida potlatch. The first 3 books in the series could be considered somewhat fictional in that they are imagined days. So they're based on interviews, but I had to kind of put them together in one day so that they would work as a story. And so those first 3 stories are based on those interviews, but then put together in an imagined day. And then the 4th book is actually the Ga'asla, or the potlatch, took place on one day. And so it would be more kind of what we think traditionally of nonfiction. To write all 4 of the books, I did interviews with my father. And then for book 3, which focuses on my brother and I also did interviews with my brother. And then that was to really make sure that the information I was sharing in the stories was accurate. And I really wanted to be sure that I was capturing the story that my father was sharing with me in the case of the first 2, and making sure that I was capturing the learning experiences as my father remembered them. And so though my father's contributions were primarily oral, it's really, really important to me to acknowledge him as a co-author, because they are, in the example of the first 2, they're his stories. And it's really important to me also in the work that I do to make sure that we are not privileging only text-based stories or stories that have been written. And so in kind of honoring that work, or as an extension of that work, it's really important to me to acknowledge my father as a co-author for these stories. So briefly, I just wanted to introduce you to the stories. So as an introduction here, in the first book, Jigging for Halibut with Chinny, this is Chinny, and this is Robert Davidson Sr. He was my great-grandfather, and you can see him here carving argillite. And the photograph next to my great-grandfather is my father as a young boy, and he's got his brand new bicycle there. He worked really hard to earn the money to get that bicycle, and so he was quite excited to find that photograph. My uncle sent him the photograph, and he was really excited to be reunited with both the photo and that memory. So the 2 of them are in this first book. Jigging for Halibut with Chinny, it's CH pronunciation, but that's the way we spell it. So I'm just going to do a brief reading here from the book, so that you get just a little kind of glimpse into the story, so you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about them. So, my Chinny always knows when the weather is right for halibut jigging. He watches the ocean and the sky and the winds, and when it is right, he says, we'll go in the morning. When morning comes, we push off the beach in a dinghy that he built and row into the inlet. We always row with the tide. Chinny sits on a board across the gunwale and rows forward in the way of the elders. I sit facing him on the bench and row backward, my back toward the bow of the boat. My hands grip the wooden oars that he made, and we make our way down the inlet. The wood knocks gently against the metal locks in a steady rhythm. We row for an hour or so in silence. So I'm going to pause there and move to the second book, which is called Learning to Carve Archeolite. And this book is actually the story of my father learning to carve. And a lot of people don't necessarily know that he learned to carve from his father and his grandfather. And often the kind of more widely told stories are about him working with Bill Reed, which he did do later. But he really learned so much from his father, Claude Davidson, and his grandfather, Robert Davidson Sr. And so in these photographs here, this is a photograph of my father carving argillite. It's a little bit later than how old he is in the book. And then on the right is my grandfather, Claude Davidson, and he was a chief of my clan. And so those are 2 of the kind of main characters in this book, Learning to Carve Argillite. There's the cover, my apologies. My dad always reminds me to work hard and help our family, whether it is chopping firewood to sell, hauling water for our home, or fishing for the family. I must always work hard to help our family. But on days like today, when I am not in school and all of the chores are done, I have time to carve argillite, a rock that is used for Haida art, just like my dad does. I do not have a workbench. Instead, I take the small argillite pole that I have been working on and go outside to sit on the steps at the front of my house. The sun shines down, warming my hair, and I can smell the salt in the wind as it comes up off the water from the inlet. Today, I am working on the eagle at the top of my pole. All the old argillite poles in the village are gone, so my ideas come from the old books filled with photographs of poles made by masters who are no longer with us. I have my favorites to copy, but they are harder to see now that those pages are covered with gray dust from the slate. And that's as much as I'm going to read about that one. So one thing that's really important when we're thinking about working with Indigenous stories and bringing them into our classroom is that we make sure that they have been evaluated. And so I wanted to just share very briefly some of the questions that I ask in connection with evaluating resources for my classroom. And so the questions that I ask are, who developed the resource? So I want to think about the ancestry of the people. And so in this case, the resource was written by my father and I. We're both of Haida ancestry. And it was illustrated by Janine Gibbons, and she is also of Haida ancestry. And that's something that's really important to think about when you're thinking about those stories and the telling of those stories, because if we have people from other nations sharing the stories of different nations from the ones that they belong to, we know that they may not have a full understanding of the significance of the story that they're sharing. And so it's not to say that we can never kind of go across nations, but for me personally, it's really important that if a story is being told about a particular nation, that the person telling it is also from that nation. How are Indigenous peoples represented in the resource is another thing to think about. And in these two stories, you'll notice that the main character, my father, is very interested in learning. He's going out, and in the first book, he goes out and learns to fish. The representation of my grandfather and my great-grandfather are very knowledgeable people who are sharing knowledge with this younger generation. And so when I read through, and I mean, I'm a bit biased, but when I'm reading through the resource, I'm looking for how those people are being represented. And in my view, that all of the people in this book, all of the Indigenous Haida people are being represented respectfully. Does the resource contain traditional Indigenous stories? In this case, all 4 books do not have any traditional Indigenous stories. For me, I made that choice because I'm a little cautious about the protocols around sharing our traditional stories. And so I chose to share our family stories, and I've called them learning stories because they are specifically focused on learning that has taken place. But that means that when we're talking about things like copyright, or we're talking about the permission to share the stories, there's something different. We're not having to go to clans or other people who may own those stories. And so for this series, I chose to focus specifically on those family narratives, family stories. Does the resource contain Indigenous art? In this series, in books 2 and book 4, yes, there is art, and it's specifically Haida art. In book 2, it is the argillite poles, and in book 4, there are masks and regalia that are represented in the art. And that's part of why it was really important to us to invite Janine to come and do the illustrations, because she is of Haida ancestry, and so she has an understanding of the deeper meaning that art holds for us as Haida people. And so that's something that you want to be looking for, and not necessarily that, that it needs to be that specific, but when you're looking at resources that have art, you do want to be asking some questions about, whether permission is required to share that art, and how it's being depicted. In this case, it's specifically Haida and as opposed to Indigenous. Does the resource contain references to or depictions of ceremonial information? And in book 4, that is true. The potlatch is a Haida ceremony. And so when I was writing that book, it was really important to me to share information that was true, but to not share so much information that I was not being respectful of the protocols around sharing that information. And so when I was writing that book, I made sure that I gave some information so that readers would understand the story, but not so much. And kind of my rule of thumb with that is, can somebody replicate a ceremony based on the information shared in a book? And I would say no, that would not be possible based on the information that I shared. But it's very, very important when we're writing about ceremonial information that we have those that awareness. And as a person of Haida ancestry, I definitely have an awareness of what it would be okay and not okay to share more publicly in the story. Does the resource honor the diversity of Indigenous peoples? And so when I'm looking at that, I'm looking at, does the resource specifically speak about nations? Because all of the different nations that we have are very, very different, even though, we do have some commonalities and some similarities. And so if I see a reference to a specific nation, I'll often feel comfortable that the diversity of Indigenous peoples is being shared. And so in this series, we're specifically talking about Haida people. And does the resource portray Indigenous peoples authentically and accurately? And I will say, based on the three of us, we've done our absolute best as Haida people to authentically and accurately represent the stories that are told in this series. And if you're interested in more information about resource evaluation, please feel free to check this out. This is an article, short article I wrote for a BCTF teacher magazine. And this is a QR code. You can just hold your device up to it and it'll take you to that article if you're just interested in learning more about resource evaluation. And I definitely encourage you to take a look. It's not the definitive answer to it. There are lots of resources out there to support you. But I think it's a really helpful place to start in thinking about the resources that we're bringing into our classrooms. So another element of the Skada story series is the Skada Principles. And the Skada Principles came from the work that my father and I did. It actually started with an article that we wrote, but it really was more developed in the potlatch's pedagogy. And so there's I believe it's chapter 2, talks about those Skada principles. And Skada is the Haida word for learn. And so just keeping in mind that these principles are not Haida principles, because I didn't consult with the Haida Nation, I didn't consult with other folks who are Haida. They're based on the stories, my father's stories. And so it was really important to name them something that made sure that that distinction was clear. And so the Skada principles are based on stories that he told me about his learning experiences. And I looked at those themes and identified these principles. And so learning emerges from strong relationships, authentic experiences, and curiosity. Learning occurs through observation, contribution, and recognizing and encouraging strengths. Learning honors the power of the mind, history and story, and aspects of spirituality and protocol. And so what you'll notice with the Skada stories, they actually were the stories that my father told me when we were writing potlatch's pedagogy that kind of connected me and helped me to understand the Skada principles. And so when you read the stories, you'll probably see, well, hopefully you'll see examples of these these Skada principles in the story. And just to be super clear, it wasn't that we wrote the stories trying to illustrate those principles. Those stories were what helped us to understand those principles. And so what you'll notice when you're reading is that some of the principles are in those stories, but not all of them. But definitely through all 4 of the stories, you'll see examples of the principles. And we definitely encourage you when you're reading to just think a little bit about those principles and think about how they're being shown through those stories. And if you're if you're so inclined, feel free to imagine what it was like hearing those stories and starting to think about how people learn. And that's where those principles came from. Making meaning. And this is a phrase that I've borrowed from Dr. Joanne Archibald, who talks a lot about making meaning from stories. And so often in English language arts, when we're working with stories, we tend to focus on those kind of comprehension type questions, identifying a plot line. And I would encourage you when working with Indigenous stories and with these stories to think about them differently and have it, use it as an opportunity to approach connecting with stories differently and just see what happens. And so Dr. Archibald wrote an article that was really focused on becoming story ready. And I found it really, really helpful in terms of thinking about how we want to approach these stories. And I don't like to make a broad generalization, but for many Indigenous peoples, storytelling is really, really a powerful kind of experience and a way to share knowledge. And Daniel David Moses speaks about the power of stories to entertain, to educate, and to heal. And I appreciate that kind of different dimension or kind of more expanded view. We often think about stories in our kind of Western society as, entertainment. And so when we're thinking about the stories in this series and perhaps other Indigenous stories, we want to think about more about their power to educate and possibly their power to heal. And in order to do that, we need to kind of make space to engage with the story. And that's what Dr. Archibald is really talking about when she's talking about becoming story ready. We need to kind of take some time and prepare ourselves before we engage with the story. And so she talks about she has 7 Indigenous storywork principles that she introduced in her 2008 book, Indigenous Storywork. But in this 2020 chapter, she divides them up. And so respect, responsibility, reverence, and reciprocity are kind of the ones that the Indigenous Storywork principles that she identifies as kind of part of becoming story ready. And so she talks about, with respect, we're thinking about deep listening and what are the conditions that need to happen for us to be able to deeply listen to a story. So we think about making space in our classrooms, make space in our time, excuse me, and just, making sure it's not sort of the last 5 minutes of the day. And we're quickly rushing. She also talks about responsibility, and in that case, just the responsibility we have to make sure that the information we're sharing is accurate. We have a responsibility to follow protocols when we're sharing stories, and so really important to make sure that we're able to do that if we're sharing the story. In terms of reverence, I always think about holding the stories gently. That's sort of the visual that comes to mind for me. So really thinking about how can we share these stories in a way that will encourage the listeners to be able to hold them gently and treat them with the respect that they deserve. And then she talks about reciprocity and the importance of sharing the stories when it's appropriate to do so, when we have permission, to ensure that the knowledge continues on. And so I found those principles really helpful to think about. And so if we think about them as sort of the kind of setting up and becoming story ready. And then she also talks about making meaning from story. And so for that, she identifies the last 3 principles, Indigenous Storywork principles, of holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. And holism has to do with kind of holistic engagement with a story. Interrelatedness has to do with the kind of the cultural information and the contextual information that needs to remain with the story. And synergy has to do with something new emerging from this engagement with the story. And I'm a person who really thinks a lot, and I've said this before, in frameworks. And so I'm quite a visual person in terms of making meaning and understanding ideas. I like to draw and create visuals for myself. And so you'll see on the right here that I kind of created this visual for myself to kind of understand what I'm doing when I'm working with a story and when I'm making meaning from a story. And so this idea of listening to the story, reflecting on the story, sharing what I've learned from the story, listening to others and what they've learned from the stories, reflecting on what they've learned, and then coming back to the story. And so often when we're working with stories, with Indigenous stories, this idea of returning to a story and perhaps getting new understandings each time we return to the story. And so I invite you just to kind of think about that. And you know, often we sort of think, okay, we've heard the story, we've done the story, we've worked the story once, and we move on. But it can be tremendously powerful to return to a story several times and just think about the new meaning that we get, especially as a result of connecting with other students in the class around the story. And engaging holistically with the story, this is based on a workshop that I do that's based on work that I've done with, you know, it's based on the work of Dr. Archibald. And she talked about engaging holistically with the story and specifically referenced mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual engagement. And so in trying to support educators to think differently about how they work with stories, I sort of developed this workshop that I do where I will share a story. And for me, it's really important to share a story that is connected locally, that is okay to be used for educational purposes. And so it might be really wonderful to find stories that you're allowed to use that are from the territory that you are teaching on. And so sharing that story orally, and then engaging physically with the story. And just to kind of maybe point something out, when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about sort of a reenactment of the story for the purposes of performing the story, but a reenactment of the story. And so sometimes folks will choose to zoom in on a particular part of the story to reenact that part. And in engaging physically with the story, they come to new understandings of the story. And sometimes people will choose to continue on with what happens next. And again, they come to these new understandings. And so this, even though physical engagement sometimes can be a little daunting for people, it's really, really powerful in terms of making meaning from the story. And an emotional connection is reflecting on the story. How do our experiences connect with those of the characters in the story? How might the characters feel in the story? And then a spiritual connection is really about thinking, what are we learning from this story? What is this story teaching us? And so I would encourage you just to think about ways that you might be able to shift your approach to working with stories to include some of these ways that are kind of more focused on making meaning as opposed to a singular understanding of a particular story. To end, I just want to talk a little bit about sharing stories. And so the Skada stories, my experience is working with older students. And so I actually, it's not that I didn't write them for younger folks. I did write them with the intention of them being able to be used with any age group. And so just for information for educators, each book is approximately 1,000 words long. And it is essentially a narrative essay with images. And the story was created based on interviews. And the stories themselves were sort of exploring a particular theme, which in this case was intergenerational learning. And so I would encourage you with your students to think about the possibility of creating your own stories that maybe follow this format or are adjusted slightly, and that the Skada stories could be used as mentor texts for those kinds of activities. And then in terms of sharing our stories, if we think back on Dr. Archibald's work about the importance of reciprocity and sharing our learning and sharing stories, and I think about the work that I do and how much we can gain from sharing those stories, I invite you to think about perhaps creating picture books that can be shared with younger students. It can be so powerful to bring students from the secondary into elementary school classrooms, and it makes the literacy that we're engaged in really relevant to the older learners, because they're creating a literacy-based creation that is going to be shared with younger students. And in terms of mentorship of literacy and modeling, that the younger students get an opportunity to see the high school students engaged in literacy and sharing stories and models as readers. And so another possibility would be creating digital books to share with those who are farther away. I think about what I just did in this presentation in terms of having some slides, doing some recordings, and being able to share those stories with folks who are maybe farther away, or during this time when we're needing to have a bit more distance between us, sharing digitally. Sharing recordings, so audio stories, and people who are able to listen to stories more so than read them. So creating an audio recording of a story and being able to experience that kind of oral tradition in the sense of working with an oral story. And then lastly, creating a video with a narration of the story and accompanying visuals. And again, I would just encourage you to share stories. I mean, part of the reason we embarked on this project was to share these stories. And I really do hope that they can perhaps be part of the inspiration for the students in your classes to share their own stories from their families and communities. So to finish up, I just wanted to again acknowledge the art in this presentation is by Janine Gibbons, and she is the illustrator, and she did give permission to use the art for this particular presentation. The photo credits, Farah Nosh, myself, and a friend of the family, Val Embry. And then the article that, or the chapter that I shared is called Finding the Bone Needle Through Indigenous Story Work. And you can find it there in Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Research Methodologies, Local Solutions, and Global Opportunities. Haua, which is Haida for thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to learn with me today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.